The débat, the honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is a privilege to rise on a point of privilege that has taken our country by storm over the last number of months. And no matter what the Liberals say, no matter what argument they throw at Canadians, it comes down to one very simple fact. The Conservative Party of Canada will not relent in our protection of the Constitution and our protection of the powers granted to this House by the people of Canada when it relates to reviewing documents and knowing what takes place in the Government of Canada. Madam Speaker, I was a member of the Industry Committee when the honourable member from South Shore spoke for the first time about the $400 million of waste in question today. Across Canada right now, Canadians are facing crises like they've never seen before. The cost of living is up big time. In my riding, food bank usage has more than doubled. Canadians are struggling to pay their mortgage. In fact, since the Liberals and the NDP came to power, house prices have doubled. Mortgages have doubled. Cost for a mortgage is over $3,500 per month, and the average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in Canada's biggest 10 cities is over $2,300 a month. Young Canadians are losing hope because the Canada they once knew is not the Canada before them today. Indeed, Madam Speaker, I've said in this House before that for a young Canadian, say someone in the age range of their early 20s, say that person is actually in a career that they make more than the average of $55,000 that the average Canadian worker makes. To save up for a home in my community would take them nearly 20 years if they put a large portion of their salary to those savings. Madam Speaker, Canadians are struggling. In British Columbia as well, we're paying a carbon tax of over $80 per ton. And just to pay the gas to get to work every day is costing Canadians hundreds of dollars a month that goes directly into the coffers of this government. Madam Speaker, just going back to housing, when we think about housing, Canadians have lost hope. Canadians don't know where to go. Canadians are wondering what happened. It's going back to the young man or young woman making a good salary in Canada. Say they were able to save up $500 or $600 a month. It would still take them close to a decade even to get into a condo in the market I live in today. Canadians are struggling. Canadians are losing hope. So when we get to the House of Commons today and we hear from this government that simply refuses to do what this House of Parliament is asking them to do, they are concerned. They are concerned that the government is willing to stall the business of this House, possibly stall a carbon tax election, a housing tax election. They are concerned. They are deeply concerned. I could talk a little bit about small businesses as well. Our productivity for small businesses is in a crisis. In fact, from May to June 2024, Canada lost 9,037 businesses and 6,331 declared insolvency year over year during that same period. The closures we are witnessing right now are even greater than the ones we saw during the pandemic, when the entire country was shut down. While Canadian entrepreneurs and workers are struggling, this government is still hiding behind a facade and hiding behind lies, Madam Speaker, about what this House of Commons can in fact ask. In the spring, I addressed the damning report released by the Auditor General, which revealed close to $400 million had been misappropriated by the board of the Sustainable Development Technology Corporation, otherwise known as SDTC. 2 weeks ago, I spoke on the privilege motion calling on the government to provide the relevant documents. Now, once again, we find ourselves discussing a sub-amendment to bring the Privacy Commissioner and the former Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee as well. Yes, Canadians want us to get on with that work. We're simply waiting for the papers. So as parliamentarians, we must stand up for Canadians and ensure they have the information needed to make informed decisions. The Liberals' refusal to table these documents has effectively paralyzed our country, hindering our ability to do the work which we were elected to do. This obstruction makes it impossible for us to address many of those pressing issues that young Canadians are faced with every day: skyrocketing housing costs, rising food inflation, and increasing crime. You know, this summer I was out door knocking across British Columbia, and no matter what part of my province I was in, no matter what street I was on, I heard about a middle-class family that just couldn't get ahead. At the end of the month, after either a massive mortgage or rent payment and a car payment, fees for school programs and athletics, they were left with nothing. And one family said to me, and it stuck out so clearly, they said, "Just a few years ago, I was donating to the food bank. Now I got to go there a couple of times a month to make up for the loss. With the cost of gas, getting to work is more expensive." And Mr. Viss, not to mention the fact that in our community today, the amount of crime we're facing as well is just through the roof. This family, like so many others, is wondering what happened to the Canada they knew and the Canada they still love. So it's more than just $400 million to Liberal insiders and friends. It's about what this country stands for and what Canadians expect us to do in this House of Commons. Let me take this time yet again to remind you of the government's corrupt mishandling of SDTC, otherwise known as the Green Slush Fund. This program was designed to support innovation in sustainable development technologies. Established in 2001, it operated with few issues under both Liberal and Conservative governments until this Prime Minister took office. In the Auditor General's report, it outlined that there were a staggering 90 instances where conflict of interest policies were not followed. Nearly $76 million spent on projects connected to friends of the Liberals who sat on the board. The most egregious example comes from the Minister of Environment, a member of Parliament from the Montreal area. He worked for a company called Cycle Capital. And at Cycle Capital has received hundreds of millions of dollars from the Green Slush Fund. In fact, the Minister of Environment still has shares in this very company. So when we on this side of the House stand up for the rights of Parliament, stand up for the Canadians struggling, the Liberal Party is only standing up for their rich friends who have been enriched by taxpayer dollars at the expense of everyone else in this chamber. Not only that, $59 million of projects were awarded that were not eligible for funding, and $12 million was spent on projects that not only fell into conflict of interest, but were also ineligible from the very beginning. This situation not only represents a betrayal of public trust, but also illustrates a significant failure in oversight by the current minister. We have to ask ourselves in this chamber, how can we ensure accountability in government if those that are in power are not held to the same standards we expect from taxpayers? Conservatives have proven through this debate that the privileges of parliamentarians were violated by the government's refusal, which is why we are continuing to speak, and which is why we will not relent about the serious action this government has taken. This is not just a procedural misstep. It is not just political wrangling. It is a direct challenge to the very foundation why all of us are in this House in the first place, and that is to approve and disapprove of how government spends money. That authority rests with the 338 of us in this chair. And as my colleague from Southern Ontario so aptly mentioned in the debates related to Sir John A. Macdonald in the province of Canada, our system of government was designed to ensure that Cabinet remained accountable to this very House. But, Madam Speaker, they're shying away from their responsibilities to be accountable. They are taking every step possible, sharing every single false argument related to prevent them from doing what is right in the eyes of our Constitution and right in the eyes of the taxpayers who pay for this place in the first place. And it's not just us saying this. The Auditor General made it clear that this scandal falls squarely upon this government, that they did not sufficiently monitor the contracts, that they did not sufficiently follow due diligence procedures. To understand the gravity of this situation, we must first reflect on the historical context of parliamentary privilege. Our rights and privileges as parliamentarians are not mere formalities. They are rooted in centuries of struggle against tyranny. As the British House of Commons, I would like to add, gained eminence as a legislative assembly, it established privileges as statutes and part of common law aimed at protecting its members from interference, namely the Crown. Erskine May, a cornerstone reference in parliamentary procedure, defines privilege as the sum of the peculiar rights enjoyed by each House collectively as a constituent part of the High Court of Parliament and by members of each House individually, without which they cannot discharge their functions. In other words, I can't do my job, nor can anyone in this House do their job, for that matter, if our privilege is disrupted. In Canada, we inherited this legacy through the Constitution Act of 1867, which enshrines our rights and privileges, ensuring that they are not exceeded by any authority outside of this House. The Parliament of Canada Act of 1985 further states that we retain these privileges, not exceeding those held, enjoyed, and exercised by the House of Commons in the United Kingdom. In other words, we inherited the democratic traditions of the Westminster parliamentary responsible government system. And this is a powerful affirmation of our rights and responsibilities as members of this institution, drawing on hundreds of years of precedents, which brings us here today. So back to the motion, in June, the opposition House Leader tabled a motion asking for all files, documents, briefing notes, memoranda, emails, and other correspondence exchanged among government officials regarding SDTC. The motion was sent through, and the SDTC and associated parties either redacted the documents, withheld the documents, or outright refused to present the documents to the official opposition. This is a clear violation of our collective parliamentary privilege. In making his argument, the opposition House Leader referred to page 239 of Parliamentary Privilege in Canada, and I quote, "Disobedience to rules or orders represents an affront to the dignity of the House, and accordingly the House could take action not simply for satisfaction, but to ensure that the House of Commons is held in the respect necessary for its authority to be vindicated. Without proper respect, the House of Commons could not function." When the rules of parliamentary privilege and the House are disregarded, it undermines the authority and the powers the House can enact and diminishes its ability to govern properly. Let us not forget that it is not the government that decides which papers it must provide. It is the Parliament of Canada which decides which paper it needs. Without respecting the use of parliamentary privilege and obeying the orders of the House to produce and bring forward the requested documents, it displays a complete disregard of respect for the House, its authority, and our duty to Canadians to provide them with accurate and transparent information. And again, why does this matter? Well, it matters because we're in a housing crisis. We will not get out of the housing crisis without building more homes.
There seems to be a phone that's vibrating, and I just want to. I'm just not sure if it's on the member's desk or on the desk beside, but I just wanted to raise that because it's a problem for the interpreters. So I would just ask members maybe to take the vibration off of their phones and make sure that they're on silent mode. The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Again, Madam Speaker, $400 million matters because Canadians cannot afford a nice place to live. We will not get out of the housing crisis without building more homes. To build more homes, we need everyone pulling in the same direction. The federal government, the provincial government, municipalities, workers, and yes, the private sector. Demonizing, taxing, and blocking private sector involvement in Canada's housing market not only keeps us from solving the housing crisis, but actually makes things worse. Smart federal housing policy incentives, smart federal housing policy incentivizes the private sector to build the housing people need across the housing spectrum instead of demonizing them. And that's what we've seen from this very government in our new policy to remove the GST on new homes under $1 million. We can't get to this important work because the government and the House of Commons has been hamstrung with this government refusal to put documents forward. So we either have to go into a carbon tax election, a housing tax election, or get to the bottom of why this government is so corrupt that they refuse to give Parliament the documents it requested. You know, since this government came to power, the price of a home in Canada has doubled. Monthly mortgage costs have more than doubled to over $3,500 per month. The average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in Canada's 10 biggest cities is over $2,300 a month, and 9 out of 10 young people in this country who do not own a home believe they never will. It now takes over 60% of one's income to cover the cost of owning a home. And according to the OECD, Canada has the largest gap between home prices and incomes of all developed countries. Canada has the fewest number of homes per capita in the G7, and the CMHC is predicting that housing starts will continue to decline by up to 32% right now. Now, the government has spoken a lot about their Housing Accelerator Fund that has actually led to no homes despite billions of dollars more of taxpayer dollars wasted. In fact, my community of Abbotsford was one of the communities that received money under this plan. And you know what? You know what the city of Abbotsford is doing right now, Madam Speaker? They're about to increase the DCC charges by 46% and levy a new $7,800 tax on all new homes built to pay for our recreation infrastructure deficit. As a young parent, I understand the need for effective recreational opportunities for our youth, but it should not come on the backs of Canadians who want to purchase their very first home. What we need to do, Madam Speaker, is incentivize more home construction. And how are we going to get there? It's to push municipalities to approve more homes quickly, to incentivize them with infrastructure dollars to densify, to build up around our transportation statements so Canadians can get to work faster, save more money, and live in the community where they are in fact working. We can do this. We are a country of resilience. But unfortunately, we've had a government that's had $90 billion directed towards housing, and all they can do is point to the statistics that I raised earlier, that housing is more expensive, that rent is more expensive, that young people don't have an opportunity to get into the market. Indeed, the Liberal record on housing is so bad that young people are giving up on owning a home and in some cases thinking about moving south of the border because there's more opportunities there. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation that says that Canada needs a total housing stock of over 22 million units by 2030. To reach 22 million units by 2030, the CMHC says we must build 3.5 million more units beyond what we are building right now. The CMHC says those 3.5 million units that are required by 2030 will require an investment of at least $1 trillion to build. The CMHC says we need increased participation from the private sector to meet those goals. And that's exactly what the Conservative Party is saying as well. Let's incentivize the private sector to play a larger role in home construction. And it's not just the Conservative Party saying this. TD Economics came out with a study in September about the productivity crisis we're facing in Canada. That report said that the crisis is no more worse than in home building construction, and we need to incentivize private sector players to get back into building homes that Canadians need, where they can live the Canadian dream. So as I turn back to the parliamentary motion before us, it is about the production of documents, but more importantly, it's what this government is signaling to the entire country. That corruption is okay, that mismanagement of public funds is okay. and that the rules that have governed our country since we came into inception don't seem to matter anymore. Madam Speaker, I don't know if this government, with the 24 backbenchers who stood against the Prime Minister, I'm calling on them to stand with the Conservative Party, to have a carbon tax election now, to have a housing tax election now, just to have an election, because it's clear that Canadians don't have confidence in the Prime Minister and that this House of Commons really doesn't have confidence in this Prime Minister any longer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?